Here is the full, natural, and fluent English translation of your powerful text, preserving every nuance, rhythm, and poetic tone. Most of us are chasing a better life. More comfort, more security, less struggle. Both those who grew up in poverty. And those born into wealth forget the same truth. When we're hungry, we no longer return to the soil, because most of us no longer reap what we sow. Supermarket shelves, packaged foods, and a piece of paper, these have become the new symbols of survival. As long as we have money, we don't fear hunger. Living disconnected from nature has become normal for humans. But when you're lost in the middle of a forest with no signal, the first thing that comes to mind is, how do I reach people? Water, shelter, food, fire. These have become concepts as distant as a documentary scene. Yet when you can't reach anyone, you begin to face nature's raw truths. You have to collect rainwater from a leaf, build a shelter to survive the night, or set a trap. And you realize that survival isn't about conquering nature. It's about overcoming our disconnection from it. Modern humans have forgotten what survival really means. Which plant is poisonous? Which insect is edible? Which stone burns? We live without knowing any of these things. As Serdar Kılıç said, the species actually going extinct in nature is humanity itself. And indeed it is. Our brains grew larger, but they filled with knowledge far removed from nature. Yet humanity's story was born exactly where this disconnection began, 11,000 years ago, around 9,000 BCE. Until then, people who tracked animals to hunt them were just beginning to learn the language of the soil. They watched the sky to predict when rain would come, followed animal tracks to understand which regions they'd migrate, to in which season. There were no cities yet, no wheels, no writing, no metal, but there was intuition, resilience, and cooperation necessary for survival. The first agriculture was born in this period, as seeds from the plants they gathered fell. Around their shelters, new ones sprouted over time. People noticed this. If they buried a seed in the ground, months later they could harvest their own food. This realization was the greatest turning point in history, because now, instead of chasing prey, they had to watch. Over the soil, observation, patience, and planning. These three taught them how to use their minds. Over time, they went beyond merely surviving on agricultural knowledge and began to predict the future. When rains, changing climates, insects, and rodents destroyed their crops, they built elevated structures with top entrances to protect their seeds. These structures eventually became new homes, and they learned to live together. That's how Çatalhöyük was born. As communities grew, production increased, surplus led to conflicts over sharing, and sharing created the need for order. People now had to concern themselves not only with survival, but with how to live. At that moment, the door to what we call civilization swung open, because a person with a full stomach had time, for the first time, to think abstractly. Sometimes, climate change turned fertile lands barren. People built stone temples, believing the gods were angry. Göbeklitepe may be one of the most concrete examples of this. At other times, decreasing rainfall lowered groundwater levels. People had to dig deeper, like deep wells. Some began building water canals, just like the Urartian Menua Canal. Those who settled down were no longer just surviving. They were also dreaming. The person who saw the seed they planted sprout realized that their own thoughts could germinate too. Instead of chasing prey, they now planned the future and tried to understand the cycle of seasons. They matched seasons to the movement of stars in the sky and learned to measure time. While managing the soil, humanity also learned to manage time. Thus, agriculture became not just a means of livelihood, but a force that transformed the way humans think. For thousands of years, these small communities were tested by seed, water, and sun. Finally, in the fertile mud of southern Mesopotamia, the first known civilization in history, the Sumerians was born. People were no longer content with merely observing nature. They began to dominate it. The society that changed riverbeds, brought measurement to the land, and made thoughts permanent through writing stepped onto the stage. And at that point, humanity entered an entirely different path. Hunger was no longer a problem, and the search for meaning began. Now, following in the footsteps of the Sumerians in ancient history, we witness the simultaneous birth of knowledge, faith, and civilization. Around 6000 BCE, people living in the fertile northern hills were forced to search for new living spaces due to climate change and population growth. The world was under the influence of a warming period after the Ice Age. Rainfall patterns had changed, and the northern lands were gradually becoming barren. For farming communities, water had become the greatest power. South of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the lower regions of what is now Iraq, every flood left behind new layers of rich, alluvial soil, making the land fertile. The presence of water and fertility in these lands played a huge role in people's migration there. But farming was risky because of the floods. They had to learn to manage water. What they carried with them was simple: seeds, goats, and primitive clay vessels. But what was truly valuable was that they had learned to work together. There was no stone or forest in these lands, just mud, reeds, and water. So they built their shelters from reeds and plastered the high walls with mud. As the marshes overflowed with floodwaters, people learned to direct the flow. They built shelters among the reeds. They channeled water into specific canals. These canals were not dug by one person, but by the efforts of the entire village. Thus, one of humanity's first collective engineering projects was born. People who managed water together now had to organize life together. This order slowly transformed villages into cities. Each season brought new knowledge. Each harvest brought new duties. As production increased, someone emerged to manage it. Goods were shared, the search for justice began. Thus, while trying to understand nature, people discovered their own nature over thousands of years. And at the end of this long journey, in the 4000s BCE, the first urban cultures, what would later be known as Sumer, emerged in the fertile lands of southern Mesopotamia. This was no longer the age of ordinary villages, but of cities where gods and humans lived together. The rise of Sumerian civilization marks the beginning of humanity's dominion over nature. The seed was now not just food, but power. Communities with more fertile fields and better irrigation. Canals grew richer. The struggle to share wealth led to conflict to the search for order, and order to law. For the first time, humanity replaced chaos with rules. These rules first took shape in temples, then in the hands of kings. In cities built around rivers, everything revolved around a temple. But these temples were not just places of worship, they were also centers of economy and knowledge. While priests offered sacrifices to the gods, they also calculated grain stocks and kept records of who owed what to whom. Writing was born from this need. This system divided people into two groups: those who worked the land and those who managed it. But this division also sharpened thought. On one side were those who sweated in daily labor, on the other, those who watched the sky. Sumerian priests observed the movement of stars. They created the calendar using the rising of the sun and lunar cycles. For the first time, people began to think of past, present, and future simultaneously. Another result of this thinking was architecture. When ziggurats were built, people sought gods not in the heavens, but in structures they had built with their own hands. These massive stepped structures reaching toward the sky were places where nature and humanity renegotiated their relationship. The Sumerians didn't just pray to gods, they tried to talk to them. Why does it rain? Why do rivers flood? Why does the sun rise? The answers they sought created a universe filled with gods. When storms came, they believed the gods were angry. When floods came, they thought they were being punished. But over time, these people noticed that natural events occurred regularly, and they decided to bring the balance they saw in the sky down to Earth. Just as stars moved in fixed orbits, human life should also be ordered. Thus, the Sumerians built their cities according to celestial law. Each city was no longer just a settlement. It was a reflection of divine order. As ziggurats rose toward the sky, streets, markets, warehouses, and homes were arranged around them in planned order. In the beginning, the burden on humans was heavy. They carried everything they took from the soil on their backs: harvested grain, sun-dried mud bricks, cut and shaped reeds. To overcome this hardship, communities living in the mountainous regions of northern Mesopotamia had animals pull heavy loads on sledges. Later, they tried dragging heavy materials over tree trunks. This method faced much less resistance. Sledges were replaced by rolling logs. This idea eventually spread south to the marshy plains of Mesopotamia. Sumerian civilization would take this idea and perfect it. First, they improved the potter's wheel. Clay now took shape on a rotating surface. This simple tool was the ancestor of the wheel, because the same principle was soon applied to transportation. Around 3500 BCE, the first wheeled vehicle appeared near Uruk, made from thick wooden planks, two large discs locked together, rotating on a central axle. Their outer surfaces were coated with natural tar to make them more durable on muddy roads. This simple yet revolutionary device didn't just make transporting goods easier, it also allowed humans to direct movement. The wheel now carried not only loads, but ideas. Going from one place to another was no longer fate, but choice. Humanity had increased its power and turned the laws of nature to its advantage, and thus that wooden disc spinning in clay transformed the future of humanity. The quietest revolution that changed the course of history began in these lands. All of this laid the foundations of Sumerian civilization. The clay tablets left behind by the Sumerians are like humanity's first library. These tablets weren't just records of barley debts, trade, or temple accounts. They contained the first great questions of the human mind. Who are we? What is the purpose of existence? What is death? These lines show that philosophy sprouted in Sumerian soil long before it was born, and the name Anunnaki appears frequently on these tablets. According to the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were divine beings who descended from the sky. They were the powers that established the order of the world and determined human destiny. In Sumerian belief, the Anunnaki represented different forces of nature: the rage of wind, the wisdom of water, the fertility of the earth. For them, the universe was a great balance in which these powers completed each other. These gods were like humans. They could be happy, angry, jealous, because the Sumerians projected their own image onto the gods while exalting them. The stories left behind by the Sumerians illuminate the period when human thoughts were first made permanent. The most famous of these stories is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known literary work in history. Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, was half god, half human. He was incredibly powerful, but also arrogant. He ruled his people and believed no power could stand against him until the gods created Enkidu, a wild man, to curb Gilgamesh's pride. Enkidu lived in nature, far from humans, grazing with animals. He knew nothing of civilization. One day a hunter saw him and told Uruk Gilgamesh sent the temple woman Shamhat to civilize him. Shamhat drew Enkidu into the human world. She spoke to him, fed him, and transferred him from animal nature to human consciousness. After this experience, Enkidu realized he could never return to his old life and went to Uruk. There he met Gilgamesh. Their first encounter was a fight. They tested their strength in the streets, but when neither could defeat the other, great respect formed between them. Over time, this respect turned into friendship. Later, they fought giant monsters together. They protected temples and strengthened their kingdom. But then Enkidu fell ill and died. At that moment, fear awakened in Gilgamesh. Will I also die one day? To find the answer, he set out on a journey. He crossed mountains and found Utnapishtim, the wise man who survived the flood. He reached the realm of gods who gave secret knowledge to humans. He sought the secret of eternal life, but in the end learned that immortality is not a gift, but a curse, because the meaning of life lies not in eternity, but in finitude. The Sumerians actually recorded their inner world on clay tablets, their fears, hopes, losses, and helplessness in the face of life's transience, because they were the first to put humanity's struggle to understand existence into writing. The end of the Sumerians didn't come with destruction, but with slow forgetting. The rivers that made their soil fertile eventually became their downfall. With each flood, salt accumulated, and with each season, more crops were lost. The fields were no longer fertile. Drought had come. Over time, people migrated north to more fertile lands, and the cities emptied. Where once thousands of voices echoed in the streets of Ur and Lagash, now only the smell of mud carried by the wind remained. But Sumerian language, religion, and ideas passed to others. The Akkadians took their cities. Babylon gave new names to Sumerian gods. Assyria inherited their administrative system. Every new civilization rose on the ashes of Sumer. Sumerian may no longer be spoken, but priests continued to use it in ceremonies, and scholars kept carving it onto tablets. Over time, riverbeds shifted, sandstorms buried Sumerian cities beneath the dunes, and for thousands of years, Sumerian civilization remained only a legend. Until archaeologists in the 19th century pulled the first clay tablet from beneath the desert. Today, neither Ur nor Nippur remains in these lands, but every alphabet, every law, every city plan, every calendar carries a trace of them. The end of the Sumerians was actually the beginning of an endless cycle of civilization. They were born from the soil and mixed back into it, but the ideas they left behind still live in humanity's memory, and perhaps that's why no civilization, even if erased from the stage of history, is as immortal as the Sumerians. See you in the next video.